Imagine you just landed at Boston Logan International Airport after spending a long day traveling. You take the T into downtown Boston and decide to walk around the city before heading back to your hotel. As you walk down the street, you pass a Starbucks. So being the coffee addict that you are, you decide to get a coffee. But when you try to pay for it, you find out that all of a sudden your card won't work. The machine is not accepting credit cards. And then you search your bag for some cash only to find that you don't have any. This goes on for a few more blocks until you finally find an ATM, where you can pull out some cold hard cash to pay for your overpriced cup of joe. Today, we're going to be exploring why. Hi, I'm your host, and this is our channel. On December 16, 1773, 9 members of the Sons of Liberty snuck onto merchant ships docked in Griffin's Wharf, also known as today's Long Wharf, and dumped 92,000 pounds of tea owned by the British East India Company into the Boston harbor. To understand why these men would go through such great lengths to destroy over $100 million worth of tea in today's money, we've got to start from the beginning. In the early 1700s, the British government was trying to get out of a massive rut that the British East India Company had been digging them into for years. You see, the British East India Company was a trading company chartered by the Crown in 1600 with the goal of trading with the East in spices, cotton, silk, and tea. At first, the company struggled, but it eventually found huge success in China. However, they needed something to trade the Chinese for, since they didn't have much interest in silver or gold. That's when the British began selling them textiles made from Indian cotton. This worked well for everyone involved, until the Dutch started entering the Indian market and taking customers away from the British. This led to decreased profits for the company and a lot of pressure from shareholders to find a solution. This is where the North American colonies come in, because Britain realized that they could use their colonies as a market to sell off excess tea. They just had one problem: smuggling. Oh boy. See, the colonies were smuggling a lot of sugar and molasses from the French and Dutch and avoiding British taxes. So Britain passed the Molasses Act of 1733, which put high taxes on any non-British molasses brought into the colonies. Now, the colonists were mad about this, but rather than fighting it, they just started producing their own sugar and molasses in the West Indies and smuggling that instead. So Britain thought to themselves, wait, we already have a monopoly on tea in the colonies. Maybe we should try putting taxes on that instead. So they did, passing the Tea Act of 1773. The Tea Act didn't actually create a new tax. Instead, it gave the British East India Company a monopoly on the sale of tea in the colonies, while lowering their prices to make them more competitive with the smugglers. But here's the catch: the East India Company would still have to pay the taxes, meaning that the other merchants who were now free to sell tea without the company's monopoly wouldn't have to pay as much in taxes and could sell their tea for even cheaper. Not to mention that the act prevented colonists from buying tea from anyone else. Now, if you're starting to get angry on behalf of the colonists, I would bet that you're not nearly as mad as they were. You see, the colonists weren't used to paying taxes. Sure, they had things like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, but those were widely unpopular and largely ignored. The Tea Act, however, was seen by many colonists as an egregious violation of their rights as Englishmen. In fact, many of them saw it as a repeat of the Stamp Act, which also lowered prices while taxing the colonies, and was also passed in order to save a failing British institution. And if that sounds familiar, it's probably because it is. Britain was hoping that the Tea Act would meet the same fate as the Stamp Act, where, after colonists protested the tax, Parliament repealed it in exchange for something less controversial. But the colonists had a much different idea in mind. Soon after the Tea Act was announced, colonial legislatures began drafting meetings to protest the act. And in response, Britain sent 3 revenue cutters to Boston to crack down on smugglers. The situation escalated further when Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson allowed the ships to dock in Griffin's Wharf, also known today as Long Wharf, instead of the usual commercial docks further up the Charles River, which was a big mistake. You see, Griffin's Wharf was controlled by the merchant John Hancock, who had recently been fined for helping smuggle wine into the colonies. Hancock was not pleased about the ships being docked there, especially since they were blocking access to his wharf. So he reached out to Samuel Adams, a member of the Sons of Liberty, and told him what had happened. Now, in case you're not familiar with the Sons of Liberty, let me catch you up. The Sons of Liberty was a secret society founded in 1765 by Samuel Adams and other Massachusetts patriots to fight for colonial rights. Their methods ranged from the peaceful protests of the Sons of Freedom to more radical means of the Sons of Destruction. Think the Boston Massacre. But no matter the method, their goal was always the same: to oppose British policies that infringed on the rights of the colonists. And with that, Samuel Adams called for a meeting on the night of December 16, 1773, under the guise of a raucous party hosted by the local Freemasons. 9 members of the Sons of Liberty snuck onto the East India Company ships moored in Griffin's Wharf and began throwing crates of tea into the harbor. While the men who took part in the Tea Party were officially identified, historians believe that many others assisted in covering up the crime. And the fact that no one came forward with information probably had a lot to do with the fact that most colonists viewed the British East India Company as a tyrannical institution, which may have been the point. You see, destroying the tea wasn't about saving a few bucks on taxes. It was a public demonstration against Britain. It showed the British that they couldn't just pass acts and expect the colonies to comply. It also served notice that the Patriots were willing to sacrifice money in the name of liberty. But perhaps most importantly, it was a clear message that the colonists were fed up with Britain treating them like children. When Britain received word of the Boston Tea Party, they responded with a series of punitive measures known as the Coercive Acts. These included closing down the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, quartering 2,000 British troops in Boston, and instituting the Massachusetts Government Act, which limited town hall meetings to 1 per year unless the governor called for one. These laws were intended to punish the colony of Massachusetts, while sending a warning to the rest of the colonies that similar fates awaited them if they continued to defy the crown. However, this backfired massively and only pushed the colonies closer together and increased support for the Patriot cause. The next year, delegates from 12 colonies met in the First Continental Congress to discuss how to respond to Britain. The attendees included men like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Patrick Henry, who demanded that the Coercive Acts be repealed, and that Britain restore colonial rule in Massachusetts. After receiving this list of demands, Britain refused to negotiate, seeing the Congress as a group of separatists looking to break away from the empire. This caused the Revolutionary War to break out in April of 1775 with battles at Lexington and Concord. Today, the Boston Tea Party is remembered as one of the most important events leading up to the American Revolution, and it continues to inspire Americans today. For example, the Republican group Young Americans for Liberty held a reenactment of the Boston Tea Party in 2013 to protest Obamacare. However, some argue that the focus on the Boston Tea Party in American memory is misplaced. Many historians point out that violent acts like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party have been exaggerated and romanticized in American tradition to the point that they overshadow the efforts of those who fought for independence through political means. Either way, whether you think it was worth all the hype or not, the Boston Tea Party definitely had an impact on the founding of America. And if you want to learn more about the Founding Fathers, we've got just the thing for you. And with that, thanks for watching.